Good evening. Please take a seat. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Human Relations Commission to order at 6:07. Roll call. Commissioner Boer, Commissioner Malik, Commissioner Ramirez, Commissioner Rosenberg had to send his regrets, Commissioner Ortiz, Commissioner Shake, and Chair Coladonato is present. Now is the time for any oral community. This is a normal meeting. It's a special meeting of the Human Relations Commission. We have a time for anyone from the public to comment on any item not on the agenda. Would anyone like to make a comment related to any Human Relations Commission business? You would? Here you go. Please state your name and use less than 3 minutes.
It's Barbara Goodwin. I live in Mountain View and have for years. I want to recommend a good book. Does that sound possible in the midst of all this? It's called Behind the Green Mask. It's not The Green Door. That was a porno film. This is Behind the Green Mask, and it has to do with the long game in housing around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Were there any other oral communications from the public on non-agendized, not related to affordable housing issues?
Linda Curtis, long-term Mountain View resident and small business owner. And I'm thinking about the outcome of the election. Would seem that there's there's a large mandate for a lot of construction going on in Mountain View. And I don't really think that's representative of most people's thinking. I think, yeah, thank you, Conrad. I have walked and talked to so many people, and I hear quite the different point of view. And I believe that believing that there is a public mandate for a lot of construction in Mountain View is really showing us the influence of big money and big corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, any other oral communications from the public? Ms. Lovins, come on up. Let me get you the microphone. Yeah, I noticed.
Julie Lovins, also a very long-term resident of Mountain View. I wanted to follow up on Linda Curtis's remark by asking if anybody who feels as she does has actually talked to the candidates who won the election, because yes, I wasn't asking for an answer. Thank you, sir. Because I know them all personally, and I question whether the conclusion is correct. Thank you very much.
Okay. I get the feeling that we're kind of getting into the topic of affordable housing in the comments. Okay, this will be the last one.
Okay. So,
please state your name.
Conrad Sosnow. So my wife and I moved to Mountain View in 1968. We scrimped and saved to buy a house, but we couldn't afford to live in Mountain View, so we went to San Jose. We scrimped and saved, and then we bought a house in Mountain View. We didn't complain about not being able to afford a house. We knew it was expensive here. We wanted to live here. We scrimped and saved, and we worked our butts off. Then we moved to Mountain View, and now we're told that because we moved to Mountain View, we're bad people. We should move out of Mountain View. Lenny Siegel has specifically stated he wants to make all the housing in Mountain View affordable. For my house, so his son and daughter can buy my house at a bargain price. He would like to reduce the value of my home to 25% of the value. My neighbor across so I'm looking to move out of Mountain View. While I can't, my neighbor across the street bought a house for $1 million. He's got a big mortgage. His concern is that if his house was reduced to $500,000, it'd be underwater and he'd have to walk away from his home. So Lenny wants a lot of us to walk away from our homes. And this really concerns me. I hope the existing city council, before January 1st, can do something to protect my home, because I'd like to stay in Mountain View, but I'm being forced out by Lenny Siegel and his buddies, who I have talked to very specifically, and Ken says he'd like to screw me and get me out of here.
Thank you for your public comment. Mr. Susno. I'd like to thank everyone for making the Human Relations Commission unagendized public comment period the most interesting it's ever been in our 12-year history of the Commission. So I'd now like to go to item 4.1, our first new business item, the Civility Roundtable Community Dialogue and Discussion. Tonight's topic is, can housing in Mountain View be affordable? I'd like to welcome everyone from the community who came out tonight. I'd like to specifically welcome some of our elected and appointed council members and committee members. I saw Council Member McAllister, Casper Zach, Abby Koga, and Chris Clark. Mayor Clark are here. Thank you for coming. I saw several members of the Environmental Planning Commission, Commissioner Cox, Scarborough, Matichak, and Kamei. Did I miss anybody so far? Okay, I saw Ms. Corns from the Parks and Rec Commission, and also Mr. Unangst from the BPAC committee. There you are. Okay, did I not say anyone's name who's been appointed to a city commission or is elected? Okay, good. So now we're going to get into the real meat of the evening, and I'm going to hand it over to Chris Block. Before I do that, I'd like to thank Commissioner Ramirez for doing all the work on the commission side to set this evening up tonight. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Mountain View Mediation Program, who's mostly sitting in the back over there. And thank you. Give them an applause, yeah. They're going to help us when we break out into smaller groups to help keep it all civil. One more thing. Could I ask everyone to come up out of the back row? We have too many chairs in the room. So we're going to remove the back row of chairs. And so that when we break into smaller groups, we don't have half the chairs in our groups being empty. So please come on up. There's plenty of seats in all the rows besides the last row. And we're going to fold those chairs up and, stack them up and get them out of the way. And I'd be remiss to not thank Ms. Castro. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Ms. Malik.
Just to clarify, the mediation group is Project Sentinel, and they do really great work, and we just really want to applaud them once again for being consistent.
And I'd be remiss to not thank Kim Castro, our staff member, our loyal and diligent staff member for the Human Relations Commission, for doing all the actual footwork to put this together tonight. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Chris Block. Thank you very much for doing this again, and we'd love to have you here, and have a great roundtable.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Let me just explain a little bit about the format of the evening. Many of you have been here before. We have about a 40-minute discussion here in this fishbowl where there's an actual dialogue that goes on, hopefully, different than a panel discussion where we actually get some discussion going on. And I also, it's good that we have this opportunity for public testimony, because there's oftentimes a real value in people being able to get their opinion out to a larger group. The challenge is that we have lots of ways, actually, particularly in local government, quite frankly, for people to do that, right? And oftentimes we don't have nearly as many ways for citizens to actually take that information and then have a conversation which leads to a different understanding. So that's the attempt today. There's 25 or 30 council meetings a year where people get to stand at the podium and give information. There's other opportunities, and occasionally in Mountain View because of the...
So I should be caring about it, even if I didn't care about these other issues, I should be caring about it because it's a traffic problem. It's also, I think, a public safety problem. And I sometimes joke that the next time, it's 25 years since we had the earthquake. Well, the next time we have a big earthquake, the safest place to be in the state is going to be Tracy. because as far as I can tell, every cop, firefighter, nurse, and lineman lives in Tracy. So they're going to be just fine. But, you know, locally here, no, I mean, literally, I remember 25 years ago, I was on the Palo Alto School Board when the quake hit. We had a meeting that night, and we made a quick decision to cancel school the next day because we didn't know if school teachers would be able to make their way from wherever they lived to the schools. Well, that problem has only gotten 25 years worse. So I literally want to make the case that housing, affordable housing, is a public safety concern for our region. I also think it's an economic vitality issue. So absent the ability to provide affordable housing for the full range of people, not just the professionals or the mid-level managers, but the full range of people who work in Silicon Valley businesses and in Mountain View businesses, then that stifles the economic growth, that stifles the tax revenue, that means there's less revenue available to the community, which means that either somebody else, us, has to pay for parks, schools, open space, or we do without those things. So absent the affordable housing, we lose out on the economic vitality, which produces a real financial cost to all of us. And then the last thing I would just say is, everybody's got a different point of view on this, but in terms of why affordable housing matters, I think it matters because of the kind of communities most of the people I talk to want to live in. I think most people want to live in communities that are generally and genuinely inclusive, where they feel connected to the people they see during the course of the day. So if you go to the pharmacy and there's a cashier, you know, it would be nice if you actually knew that person and they were part of your community. More than 25 years ago, when I was a kid, my father was a teacher in Palo Alto, at Palo Alto High School. He bought our single-family home with one school teacher's salary. I went to school with my friend Gary, whose dad was a mechanic at Slack and who worked a second job as a cashier at a liquor store. Our classmate Joy, whose father was the custodian at Palo Alto High School. And another one of our classmates was the daughter of Bill Hewlett, the head of Hewlett-Packard Company. Nobody thought that was odd at the time, that a teacher's kid and a mechanic's kid and a custodian's kid and a CEO's kid would all live in the same community and go to the same school. And I thought it was a better model that my father could walk down the street, bump into his students, talk to their parents, be connected to the community where he taught, and have that understanding and sort of really be a part of the place where he did his work. That has become harder and harder to achieve, and I think our communities are the worse off as a result of the stratification that pushes some people great distances away while allowing others to stay put. So if you care about the nature of your community, if you care about public safety, if you care about traffic, and you care about economic vitality, then you ought to care about the housing issues that may seem like somebody else's issue, but I would really argue are ours. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'll try and be short.
Let's push on that a little bit. So let's take it apart just a little bit. So from the people here, how important is affordable housing to the overall economic vitality? And I'm going to separate this out so that we can, first we're going to talk about these general benefits that you've discussed, right? Housing does take place in communities, so there seems to be some relationship between the benefits we're talking about and the communities that we define. But then we'll move on to whose responsibility is it, and we'll get very specific about that, because that's a separate question. We can agree on lots of things and then decide it's either my responsibility or not to help to achieve those things. So let's talk a little bit first about the economic vitality. How important is it to your members, Shiloh, that there be affordable housing? I mean, is it, and for workers now and for workers into the future?
So before I answer that question specifically, I wanted to address your previous question, which I think is essentially asking, I think I'm getting the I'm not being heard sign.
Get your mic's not on.
Move your binder out of the way. Just closer.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Aim it. That's what.
Perfect.
I think you were essentially. The answer is yes. Diversity is good. All kinds of diversity in a community. Inclusiveness is good. I do not want to live in a community that is all the same. It's just, I'm not sure how to explain it, but having a very diverse community in many different ways means that we are all learning from each other, we're learning different things, and that's good. It's not, any Margaret Atwood fans where she writes these post-apocalyptic, you know, the society, all the rich people live here and they have a gated community? I don't want that. That's a horrible society, and I hope we're not going there. So anyway, but in answer to your actual question about the economy and the relation to affordable housing, on an annual basis, the leadership group surveys its members and asks the question, what are the top impediments to doing business in Silicon Valley? And every year, affordable housing is the top vote-getter. So from an economic point of view, in terms of having a thriving, strong economy, absolutely the businesses that are represented by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group believe that housing and affordable housing is a key ingredient to a strong economy.
Can I ask Shiloh a follow-up question?
No.
Okay.
I'm just kidding.
Only a nice one that isn't going to put me on the
We hope
spot.
you ask each other questions. I'm kidding.
Drilling down on the sorry, Mark. Drilling down on the CEO survey about affordable housing, are you talking capital A or lowercase a? Are the CEOs looking for housing that's subsidized or housing that's attainable for their employees who make $85,000 to $110,000 a year?
All of the above. Housing for housing that's affordable to a dental assistant, and housing that's affordable to an engineer.
Let's get rid of that one. Sorry.
Now it sounds like it's working.
Yeah, now it works.
Chris, if I could comment on that. Is this one working?
Now, pull it closer.
It won't go any closer. Does that one work now? No? Okay, I think obviously there's the ideal, and I don't think anyone would leave the room here, you know, unscathed if they said for some reason that they were not in favor of affordable housing. But when you ask the question of what's the role of the community, I think one of the important points and part of the frustration here in Mountain View is the lack of planning and understanding as to how this can be reachable, no matter how you define it, whether it's more subsidized housing, more vanishing middle class housing. And the question is, you know, what are the mechanisms in place that our government has that we could exploit to a greater extent to make more housing? And again, I mean, obviously, this is not a forum to discuss all of those specifics, but I think the role of the community is to push their representatives to do the kind of planning that we need so that we know what is the capacity for the community to provide this level of diversity. And if it means, you know, if someone says, well, you have to build 100,000 units and, you know, but you don't have the capacity, then what's the next level and what's the next level? So I think the role of the community is to plan and actually figure out how this can happen.
If we can go back, I want to go back, if I can, to the question that of the economic viability of communities, because I think that's a key question that we all ask ourselves, because whether if you're a homeowner, if you're a small business person, if you're in the community, again, I want to separate my personal view, which is very aligned with what you've heard at the table about the importance of a diverse community. But, you know, putting aside my personal view, if you just look at the data and you look at somebody like, there's a real estate economist, Richard Florida, who is, you know, done a lot of research on where knowledge workers want to be. And they want to be in diverse communities. There is, and if Silicon Valley is going to remain competitive, we need to attract the best and brightest. We need to maintain our diversity and create and have opportunity for everyone to live here, to have a balanced community, so that we can continue to attract the kind of workers that support the investments people have made in their housing, support the lifestyles that people have. And I think, I mean, on a personal side, there's a basic dignity that everybody deserves. Everybody who works, everybody, and people that can't work, there's a basic dignity to being a human being. And, you know, you can get into the issue of how to solve it. I mean, I think it's once you agree that, you know, kind of agree on, you know, the capital A and small a of affordable housing, I think you can get a lot of agreement on that. And then you can also, I believe, whether you have a personal viewpoint or not, I believe the unbiased, non-observational data would tell you that a balanced community is a healthy community and an economically viable and vibrant community. Then you have to get to what we just talked about, which is, okay, if we can all agree on that now, how do you solve the problem?
And we will get there, definitely. Go ahead. This is a talking stick.
This is the conch.
Yeah.
Pass the conch. Because Chris runs the ALF here in Silicon Valley, I wanted to, you know, you try to explain, why is diversity good? You know, why is having an inclusive community good and having economic diversity good? And I wanted to use the example of, you know, I'm going through the LF program, which is an incredible experience and is very intentional about putting people with different people and learning and building these strong relationships. And I want to use that to illustrate how important diversity is in a community, because I was very intentionally, I believe, partnered with someone who is very different than me. She just recently went through a surgery and ended up not being able to walk, and I'm an incredibly active person. And we were partnered together, camping together in a tent. And because I was exposed to this person in ways that I otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to, and learned how difficult it was for someone in her situation, I just learned so much from this person who's very different from me. And there's this value to that I think is hard to describe. I'm having a hard time describing it. But I use that as an example of why diversity in a community is so incredibly important. It helps us to understand other people that we wouldn't otherwise understand. And that in and of itself, I believe, makes society better.
So in some ways now we've done the easy part, right? We've defined affordable housing, and we've talked about its benefits to a community. It creates a balanced community. It creates a diversity of community with all of the benefits of that. It has some important economic impacts. It clearly is helpful to transportation issues. The question, though, is and this is also you know, I'm big on two-part questions. Can you tell?
No compound questions.
I thought we'd agreed on that before. But there's two, and then we'll talk a little bit about the how of it. But there's two questions that get underneath this, and the first is, while all these things may be valuable, there's a lot of things in the world that are valuable, right? There are a lot of things in the world that are important. And so the first question is, why is it important for a particular community to take responsibility around affordable housing? One could argue it's a regional issue, it's a statewide issue, it's a national issue. And then the second thing is this notion that was referred to, and not this notion, but this reality of, after we look at what is a community's responsibility, then what is a neighbor's responsibility? Because of this concern that people sincerely express, that depending on how we do this thing, how we create this benefit, right? As an individual, I could be harmed, or my neighborhood could be harmed, or my schools could be harmed. So let's talk about the community's responsibility, right? And then let's talk about these concerns that people have, these individual concerns that people have that are sincerely expressed and come up often when we're talking about this particular issue.
Well, I think it's a very understandable, expectable human reaction. We'd all like to have affordable housing, and we'd like somebody else to bear the burden, pay the cost, and do the work to make that affordable housing available. I mean, that's just, welcome to human nature, it seems to me. So then the question is, can we get everyone to agree that it's an important enough value that we all do our fair share from community to community? And then, of course, there's a big debate about what our fair share is. So, I mentioned I live in Palo Alto. Palo Alto has a jobs housing imbalance of about 3 to 1. So I think you can make a pretty good case that in that way, Palo Alto is part of the problem, not part of the solution. On the other hand, for decades, Palo Alto had one of the relatively few inclusionary zoning ordinances in place that meant that whenever new development took place, there was a set-aside of affordable units, and that was sometimes unpopular, sometimes controversial, but in that way, Palo Alto said, we understand we have an obligation to make a place for more than just those that can afford the market rate. And it was, I thought, an important and, over time, a significant contribution to solving the problem. So I don't think any of us are surprised or should be surprised that, we'd all like the benefits of having plenty of affordable housing, and we'd all like somebody else to do that hard work for us. That's a pretty normal human reaction, I think, when you're dealing with those kinds of issues.
And I want to add on to that. I think that I heard multiple times, right, about values, and that we feel like people have some intrinsic value and deserve some dignity. And I think if a community really believes that the community has a responsibility to express those values through their public policy and through individual responsibility. And I think if we really say we value diversity, then we really have to take some responsibility and not say we'll have diversity, but at the cost of others, at the cost of that low-income Latina mother that is scraping by, whose child will fall behind in school because she's working 2 jobs, doesn't have time, and the stress is also impacting the child. So I think if we really value diversity, we all take responsibility and not just let someone else take the burden for it.
Which you could come at from a housing angle and say, therefore you have to do something about the cost of housing. Or you could come at from a wage angle and say, maybe that's a conversation about minimum wage or a living wage. But my point is just, there are lots of different ways to come at that disconnect between the resources people have and the costs of essentials like housing, healthcare.
Okay.
Absolutely. So please.
Well, so, as a follow-up to that, I'm sorry, I'll do my best. As a follow-up to that, if we, once a community, and again, I think being a developer that works in numerous communities on the West Coast, I mean, if a community decides, and hopefully they do, that they embrace diversity and they embrace affordable housing, once that's decided, and it needs to be decided. Again, it's a process, and I'm a very big believer that that communities need to have a thoughtful process to decide this. I think the worst thing that can ever happen is when things, and as much as we like things to happen very quickly, because everybody says, oh, time is money, I still think that important things like diversity and community, basic community values need to be talked about. But once a community reaches a decision, you still get to what my job is, which is the practical aspect of producing the housing. And at least from my experience, a community can do a little bit, but the most powerful tool that the development community and government had to produce affordable housing was taken away, and I don't want to get into the issues of taking away redevelopment, but the state of California took away redevelopment, and redevelopment was probably the most important tool in the toolbox for the affordable housing producers and for government to basically start to address the problem. And I understand why they took away redevelopment, but they haven't done anything to try to fill the gap. And it's a huge gap. And without basic action from the state to try to fill that gap, it's going to be very difficult to produce the kind of the amount of affordable housing that we need to keep the vibrant and balanced communities that we all desire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to follow up that, Luis, I want to follow up that comment with a comment you made about the right sort of planning. But really, when you talked about it, really what I heard was that there needs to be a larger vision that the community supports and is involved in. So talk a little bit more about what would be the parts of that kind of vision or plan that would give this community, residents in this community, some assurance that they could fulfill these requirements or this affordability plan that we're talking about, and still have the community that they desire and that makes sense for them?
Well, first of all, I think there is a tremendous amount that can be done, and something that I've advocated for, because I've heard a lot of people say that one of the primary questions for a city like Mountain View that has its geographical limitations, and I'm sure it's the same for Palo Alto and San Francisco, but again, what is capacity for a town like this? So we have limited land, we have limited resources in terms of our tax base, we have overwhelming demand, and so the question is this the kind of planning that we would need, that I would think would be a true urban planning program for a city like this? Neutral, not, basically a professional neutral kind of planning that can say to the taxpayers and the governing body, if you build 50 high-rise buildings from El Camino, south, whatever, you will need X number of stoplights. If you have X number of stoplights, your traffic will look like this. If you put in 10,000 units that bring in, 5,000 more children, here's what you need to plan for your school system. Here's what the cost will be. And in order to say that you want diversity, the question is, where are the resources going to be allocated for this diversity? And if we as a community decide that we would rather pay $100 million for a bridge to get people to work over 101, then we're not going to necessarily have $100 million to put into new schools. So I think that is the kind of planning and transparency that the community, with this amount of pressure on it and potential for a monoculture in terms of who lives here and who works here and the kind of businesses that we have, to not have this monoculture in terms of housing and people. I think we need to know what's our capacity, how do we get there, and how do we want to allocate our resources. And that shouldn't be a block by block fight with every developer and with every neighbor that does or doesn't like something. I think we need information as taxpayers, and I think this model would work up and down the peninsula.
So let's talk a little bit more about this. What from your perspective, and maybe we'll start, Joshua, with you as the apartment guy. Let's talk a little bit about your experiences with, right, a community planning process, a community plan, a strategy around building affordable housing, right? That Mountain View could look at that would give the community the assurances that Luis has suggested, right? And even if you get more specific, how do you build into that plan, giving people, giving neighbors some assurances that while nothing is a risk-free proposition, right, we're going to be able to do this with at least great sensitivity to existing residents.
To make sure everyone can hear me, I'll use your microphone. I want to go back to something we were talking about a minute ago, and that is the role of the community. And I think one of the things that the supervisor brought up and touched on was the issue of transportation. And I think our housing issues are caused by our transportation issues, and our transportation issues are caused by our housing issues. And we have this vicious circle. And if we actually had a better transportation network in Silicon Valley, we could actually get people around Silicon Valley, get them around from Mountain View to San Jose, not from one stop to another in different parts of town. You know, I'm one who loves going to New York City because I can get anywhere I want to go, whether it's in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, or Queens, within 15 to 20 minutes by just hopping on the subway.
But do you want to live in New York City?
I would.
A lot of people do.
A lot of people do.
But a lot of people don't.
There are some great parts of New York City. I haven't been there enough to say I want to live there, but their transportation network can get you from Staten Island, which is very suburban, all the way to Manhattan. And if we had something like that, we could probably reduce the headache that you had today getting here. And we also would be able to get people to and from work, and they could probably afford to live in other places because they're not going to be stuck in traffic and forced to live in Mountain View so they can get to Google. They could live in San Jose or Morgan Hill and hop on the train and get there much faster. So I think we have. I'll pause for the applause. Thank you. But
I took the train here.
and we thank you for that, Shiloh. But you know, growing up, my parents both were retail sales clerks, and I was fortunate that they scraped together to send me to good schools, and I am where I am today. And I remember we lived in a very small 2-bedroom, 1-bath home for at least 15 years until they saved the money for a down payment on a home. And I remember my parents were very, very concerned when they bought their first home about the apartment community that was going in 3 blocks away. They were concerned about traffic. They were concerned about, you know, construction noise. They were concerned about dust. You name it, they were concerned about it. And I said, what's the big deal? It's just 50 more homes. And my parents had a much different reaction than I did at the age of 10 or 12. But I think as a community, what we need to really do is understand, as my parents were, that sometimes this world where we live in is evolving. And as we're growing, we have to understand and find our place in that growth and help shape that growth and that evolution. And if that means that we're going to become a more urban community, whether it's in Mountain View or whether it's in San Mateo or whether it's in Morgan Hill, I think we have to have open dialogue with the residents about what the community can look like and make sure everyone still has feels their sense in that community. Because I think all of us, I mean, I am now at the age where I'm concerned about my neighborhood in San Jose changing. Even though, you know, I'm told it's going to be much better. And I'm sure it will be, but I get concerned because I bought a home 5 years ago and liked what I bought into, but I have to sometimes step back as a homeowner and realize that to be part of the community means to help shape the process. And I think that's what we have to make sure we do as we look towards the future. We have an open and inclusive dialogue with everyone to help make sure they put their fingerprints on that plan. And it may not be what we or what I as an individual want in San Jose, and it may not be what Sally Smith here in Mountain View wants, but if Sally Smith has a seat at the table, she'll feel much more comfortable with what comes out, or at least can be part of the democratic process that has helped shape planning for so long.
I do something called sidewalk office hours here in Mountain View and the other communities I represent, and it's nothing fancier than throwing up a card table and a sign at the farmer's market, and people come and tell me what they think. And sometimes they say, why did you do this? Or I think you ought to do that. I have to tell you that the first year I was back in this role as county supervisor, 2013, I have never had as many comments about development issues in all the years I've been doing sidewalk office hours and other roles as I did in Mountain View in 2013 and now 2014. And the conversations were really fascinating because people would say, on the one hand, I don't like all this development. And then on the other hand, somebody would say, we need more affordable housing. But I don't like all this development, but we need more affordable housing. But I don't like all this development. Now, those were always interesting conversations. They were particularly interesting when it was the same person saying both of those. No, I'm quite serious. Some people would say both things. They would say, I said, what's on your mind? I'm very concerned about all the development, and by the way, we need more affordable housing. And I say that because one of the ways that we get people to yes on affordable housing is, it sounds simple, but it's a little harder. I think elected officials should vote for good projects and vote against bad ones. And I think I consider myself both a housing advocate and an environmentalist. And I don't have any problem reconciling those two things. And so if you're going to vote for a good project, and if you get some pushback from the environmental community, then you need to talk about how good planning, including housing, is sound from an environmental standpoint. On the other hand, we do the cause of affordable housing a disservice if we vote for bad projects and then alienate the community and limit their acceptance going forward of worthy projects when they do arrive on the table. So, as I say, as simple as it is to say, it is sometimes hard to manage in the political process, which is vote for good projects, vote against bad projects.
I think you raised something really interesting, and I remember when I first started working in local government about 15 years ago, I was with the elected official I worked for, and we were going on this tour of their district, and we stopped at this one apartment community, and she said, this is a completely affordable, subsidized housing project. And I looked around, and it was, I would never know the difference because right next door to it was a fully market rate project. And I was thinking back to my in-laws who grew up in Salinas, grew up in farm worker housing, and told stories of just how decrepit and derelict the conditions were that they were raised in. And I was thinking, no wonder there is such a stigma about affordable housing. We don't recognize that the affordable housing and the good projects that you're talking about can fit in with the neighborhoods. And affordable housing with a capital A can be a good neighbor if we can overcome this stigma, one, of what our notion of those projects, if you will, that we think about from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, to what is being built today by Mid-Penn Housing, Saris Regis, when they do affordable units on their project, or Eden and Bridge and Rome. There's a difference in what affordable housing is today versus what many of us, myself included, think of when we think of a 50 or 100 unit affordable project. And if policymakers and planning commissioners and community members get involved, we have a much better project that's of higher quality and promotes that diversity, because it's oftentimes people who are making middle income that can't afford the new project here in Mountain View that's coming on at market rate, but are residents who teach in our schools, work in our schools, and maybe even work for the county or the city.
Can I respond to both of those? Because I'm hearing a lot about new development and bringing new affordable housing in, but I think something that we haven't been talking about is how do we maintain existing housing affordable? Because there are people that do add to the diversity of, for example, Mountain View right now, and they are getting kicked out every day. And if we say we value diversity, not just bringing in diversity, but maintaining the diversity we already have. And that goes back to even just what you were speaking to as the transportation, improving transportation network. I think it also on the housing end, I have one woman in San Mateo who got evicted, her rent got too high. She's now in Modesto commuting to San Mateo. And that's a single mother commuting every day, and it's adding to the transportation problem that you have so many people who are already getting kicked out. And I think it's not just about how do we add more diversity through adding more affordable housing, but how do we keep the people here that are already here, keeping them here in this community.
So, Chris, I think you were touching on something that I find particularly fascinating as a democracy freak. We live in a democracy. We're fortunate to. I think it's a wonderful, interesting model for ruling a society. And at the end of the day, I almost called you Senator Simidian, Supervisor Simidian. Old habits die.
Joe.
I don't know, that's too disrespectful. I would lose my job. You're accountable to the voters at the end of the day. We voters, the people in the room, we wield a lot of power. And so that's fascinating.
I'm not sure I like where this is going, Shiloh.
So, Chris, you were asking, I think you were asking about the community engagement piece of things, the community planning piece of things. And I spend a lot of my evenings going to city council meetings, going to community meetings, watching this play out. And I can't say that I've ever seen it done well, which is very depressing. It's usually a train wreck. In fact, my mother just came from an urban village planning meeting in San Jose a couple nights ago or last week, and she is a regular person who got a notice in the mail and said, I'm going to go to this community meeting because it looks interesting, and by the way, my daughter happens to work in this stuff, so it's, it could be fun, and I could report back to her. So she goes to this meeting that's set up in a way that typical meetings are set up, with the presenters in the front and the audience here. So already physically it's set up in a way that creates a dynamic, right? Which is very different than you've set up here, or that has been set up here. And she came back and she was very disgruntled because people came to the meeting very angry and yelling and dominated the meeting, and she felt like she really wanted to contribute, and she had something to say, and she wasn't given an opportunity to because it was dominated by folks who were just angry. So anyway, how do you do this well? How do you do the community engagement piece well, especially in a ever-evolving society where technology is changing how we communicate and how we interface with each other? I mean, is it important for us to require people to go to a city council meeting to be heard anymore? Is the model of going up and spending 2 minutes to express yourself to the city council, perhaps that's an old model that doesn't work anymore and needs to be revisited? I don't know. But I can tell you, I think it's incredibly important that we're thinking about it and we're proactive about how we do it better. And I haven't come up with a better way yet, but think it's very, very important.
I will say that I've been in a fairly significant number of these kinds of conversations over the last 25 years, and I have not seen it done well oftentimes either. I will say, though, that this is why we're attempting to do it in this way. So I think probably the public process requires podiums and 2 minutes and microphones, but if that's all there is, then that's a problem.
I think that's the key phrase, if that's all there is. Look, if we wanted to make sure people couldn't have a real conversation, we couldn't do better than the current system of trotting people up to a microphone, giving them 2 minutes to talk to people who are elevated above them at a specific time and place, which may or may not be convenient for the vast majority of people who you need to hear from.
And to sit through hours of a hearing to do that.
That's right. So
it's the blood sport of California.
Well, it may have some utility, but I think, ask yourself, if you were trying to market a product, would you tell people you need to come to a central location and wait for a couple of hours and then stand in line for the privilege to tell us for 2 minutes? I mean, if you wanted people to be engaged, you would never do that. So that's why, as hokey as sidewalk office hours is, that's a different problem. On the other hand, some people want to come to a forum like this and sit down and have the conversation. Some people want to do it online. So you meet people where they are, I think, is the answer in terms of letting them engage and inform your thinking about these issues.
Let me give you one example that definitely comes up. It's when people stand up at the podium, right, and they have their 2 minutes, right, then everything becomes this crystallized, hard opinion, because you've got to be so clear and so almost strident in 2 minutes, right? Here's the nuance that comes up often in these conversations. It's completely reasonable. I'm a homeowner. I put everything I have into my home, right? I'm very concerned. I mean, I am a homeowner, and I have, I'm very concerned about the value of my home, right? That's a reasonable position to take, right? You should be, right? And oftentimes, though, I talk to homeowners who are also parents, right? And they want to protect the value of their home, completely reasonable position. And they want their kids to be able to afford a home in the same community, which will have a different value most of the time, just the way it's set up. This is the hard reality of being in the world, and I think where we go off track is if we think that same person is either bad or good. So it's the same person. That same person is not good when he cares about if his kids have a home, and bad when he cares about his home values, right? It's the same person living in a complex world, right? So this part of what we're trying to do here is to acknowledge that the same person can feel the same way about the same issue and be right each time. So then we go back to Luis and what other people have said around this table. Can we create a process in Mountain View or in other places where all of that is acknowledged, and we develop a planning process, right, that at the end of the day isn't either or. This is the and easier to say here, right? But that's the, Louise, please.
The thing that I wanted to add, is this where?
Take the talking stick.
The talking stick. Is that we're getting a little bit, I think, into the apples and oranges, because you're talking about projects that are being developed in accordance with the law that determines who will live there based on their income. And of course, there is a vast pool of people who need this housing who are never, ever going to get even close to it because of the years-long waiting list. And Araceli is saying that there are people who are paying their way as taxpayers and are still unable to keep their heads above water, and there is not going to be the kind of resource, even if they qualify, for these people, especially in Mountain View, because if there was this resource, they would be using it already, and they wouldn't be driving from Modesto. So, I think, we started talking about what's affordable. I've been to a certain number of the council meetings and the planning commission meetings, and the tech workers get up and say, but we're here, we're important, we need affordable housing, and that's not the same thing as what you are building, and it's not the same thing as what your constituency is necessarily trying to hold on to. In other words, the people who have the older units that were once upon a time affordable are, as you pointed out, they're disappearing, and people are basically getting thrown under the bus. And at the same time, if as a community we can have planning that we can say, here's how much developer fees we can throw at the problem, here's how many we can build based on this, here's how much taxes we can ask people to pay to make more affordable housing, both at the level of, percentage for the tech workers, percentage for, lower income workers, et cetera, that I think then as a society we have to choose who is going to get these units. Is it going to be the nurses and the x-ray technicians? Is it going to be, people in the service industry? Is it going to be the tech worker who says, I'm already working 12 hours a day, I shouldn't have to commute to Fremont? So that is part of the problem, is that as a community, nobody wants to have that discussion because it's not a pleasant discussion when we have limited resources.
And I think, I was a local city council member 20 years ago, and my view at the time, which hasn't changed, some of my views have, obviously, with the benefit of years of experience, but I had the view then and I have the view today that we cannot rely solely on the market to create an adequate supply of affordable housing for all income ranges in a community. So if we really care about that issue, then we have to step up as communities and say, what are we prepared to do to step in where the market will not serve that purpose? So inclusionary zoning was one way. It's a tool that is no longer as readily available. Mark mentioned in passing the affordable housing funds that came through redevelopment. That was a tool that was available in some communities, not all, but it's a tool that's no longer available. And I don't want to let Mark's comment go by sort of just like that. It's been 3 years. The governor and the state legislature, of which I was a part at the time, made the commitment that when redevelopment went away, there would be a replacement for affordable housing funding. So we should be pushing back at the state level on that. But I think the truth of the matter is the market serves some of the necessary function to create a range of housing types, but it's not the only way, and it can't be the only way. And so I think if we say we value it, then back to your point earlier, Louise, it's like, well, are we prepared to put our money where our mouth is? And, what does that look like? And, again, to Josh's point, I want to say, I lived in a capital A affordable housing project when I was a kid. My mother was a single mother, and she raised me till I was 14, and it was multi-story, and it was dark, and it was dirty, and she aspired to get us to a better place, and credit to her. If I can give my mom a plug, she did it. But that capital A affordable housing was the starting point. And, is that going to be there as a market function? Probably not. So if we want to have a 21st century better version of that affordable housing, it's up to us to say, how are we going to pay for it and how are we going to make a place for it?
And that is a great discussion for us to all have together, because really that's the question in many ways that we have to ask ourselves and ourselves as members of communities. And we're going to have Louise with a final comment to send us out.
I don't want to bring up the 900-pound gorilla.
Talking stick.
Sorry. We haven't talked about the 900-pound gorilla in the room, but obviously, as a community, we have very little control over what we can provide as taxpayers from outside sources, inside sources, whatever, if in fact we don't have the ability to control the demand. Because there is simply going to be the cost of land, there's going to be the cost of construction, and there's going to be an ever-increasing sort of tsunami of need. So that is the question that obviously we're not going to discuss tonight, but I think it should be.
Can I throw one more provocative question in just because I'm in the mood to make some mischief? So what if you said, I'm not proposing this, what if you said...
Yes, you are.
No,
in one way or the other.
No. What if you said, we don't have additional commercial development unless the necessary housing is developed simultaneously, concurrently, to accommodate the housing demand created by that development. Now, 15 years ago, when Stanford came to the county, because it's unincorporated, and said, we want 2 million square feet of facilities and we want the authorization to build 3,000 housing units, we not only said, okay, we'll not only give you the authorization to build those 3,000 housing units, we'll require you to build those 3,000 housing units as a necessary condition to build the 2 million square feet of facilities. Now, it worked at Stanford because it's a residential campus and they are in both the facilities business and the housing business. But, when they got to their first 500,000, they couldn't go farther on facilities until they met their housing requirement. When they got to the 1 million, they couldn't go farther until they met the housing requirement. But, we've been creating jobs back in the 90s at the rate of, half a dozen to 1 per housing units, and then we were surprised that there was a shortage and a high cost associated with housing. Why should that surprise us? So, that's just wanted to make it harder, not easier when we go to our groups.
No, you guys, you will all have a chance to have further this discussion with people who in the audience. We don't actually have a question and answer period, but these folks will be in the smaller groups as well. So trust me on this setup, because we could spend 30 minutes and then be set up in a way that's not going to be helpful, or we could take a couple minutes and really have a good conversation after. Here's my suggestion to you. Each of these suggestions is too large, each of these sections is too large a group. You won't have a great conversation. So what I would suggest is that each of these sections, that the first section, 3 rows and up, you all turn your chairs so you can comfortably see each other, because you're going to have a small group discussion. The second half of each section does the same thing, and so that you end up with 2 group discussions in each section. You're going to have a mediator from Project Sentinel in each group, and if you don't, then we'll step in. And the people here, the people in the fishbowl, are going to have the discussion with each of them with a small group.
Split up the fishbowl.
3-minute warning. So if you've got the solution and you've been holding back from telling everyone, now's the time. are you? I have a chocolate lab at home.
Did I make sense?
Yes.
Just in case I don't see you.
Oh, thank you. All right, everybody, we're done with this part of the conversation. So, wrap this part up. So what I want to ask people to do, we're not going to do a big rearrangement of the room, but just rearrange your circles so that just spread your circles out so you can see me and the other side of the room, and the other side of the room can see me and the other side of the room. I want to make a couple of just observations. And then what we're going to do is we're not going to do report outs in the traditional way. We're just going to ask some people to stand up and tell us what they've learned or what the possibilities are that they've discovered around this issue as a result of the conversation. I always think it's very good news when it's hard for people to pay attention to me because you've been having a good conversation. So, the first thing that I want to say is that a lot of times, quite frankly, one of the comments I sometimes hear is, well, gee, all we did is talk. All we did is talk. And I guess at one level that's true, but my position would be that, what we did tonight, right, isn't going to result in a council vote in 10 minutes, right? And none of you are going to probably be financially better off as a result, right? But I will tell you that in my experience, and I think in the experience of the world, great things happen only because people get together and they ask each other, what if? Or they ask each other, did you ever think about? Or they say, I'm really scared about this happening or that happening, and somebody says, I understand, I wonder if you've ever looked at it this way. That's how really important things happen, I think generally in the world, but that's exactly how they happen in communities. And so it's much to your credit that on a Thursday night, 2 days after the election, that you're here and that you're willing to engage with your neighbors in this conversation, not because you all agree with each other, but because you all have a collective sense of relationship with each other around this community. And that's really important. And so much the better that actually in these small groups, there were people who actually do have some capacity to make a difference tomorrow because of the work that they do. And so we all had a chance to inform folks that actually wake up tomorrow morning with specific responsibilities in the world where the conversations we had can inform them pretty immediately. So I'm more convinced than ever that this is sort of at the root of what we call democracy, and it's certainly at the root of what we call community, and it's the way that we actually make communities work for all of us. So I want to thank you. It's really it's a great opportunity for me to be a part of this, so I appreciate that. What we want to do now is we're going to take a few minutes. We're not going to do report outs in the traditional sense, but we feel that if we get 6 or 7 people to stand up and let us know what they've learned, or something that is a possibility that they didn't consider before, or the great solution to affordable housing in 60 seconds or less, we want to spend a few minutes doing that, and then we'll wrap it up and send you on your way by 8:30. So if anybody want to start? Then it's easy. Yeah, please.
Well, the most remarkable thing that I've had here is take the jobs to the people so the people won't have to scramble for housing.
Thank you. You will have that opportunity.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much for giving us the opportunity, the chance to be here talking about this. It's extremely important to be talking with people. Mr. John Smith, I talked to you at the farmer's market over there. Thank you so much. And the mayor and everybody in the city council, we have many times chance to talk. Not only when we go over there, we use those 2 or 3 minutes to talk about issues, terrible issues that we have in Mountain View, but we also have been talking in person, in private, and we have been sharing our thoughts and our problems. So I just want to say thank you so much because you opened the door to do this. We are doing something thanks to so many people in here. We are opening each other. We are talking about it. We're helping each other. I think it's so important what we're doing. Thank you so much to listen to us and for giving us the chance to talk about Latinos in Mountain View. Thank you.
Well, I was taking notes in my group because we thought we were going to each report back on our whole group, right? So let me just touch on them as quickly as I can. But we had a great discussion, and we started talking about the definition, and something I contributed was affordability with a capital A is subsidized, so we don't get mixed up. And then the small a is attainable, something you could actually afford to get into, you know, so we could tell them apart. We talked about, yes, we definitely value diversity. And where are we finding some attainable housing at this point? I know that some of the oldest building is the best choice for people that are financially challenged, and they have maybe more space and yards and good area for their children and pets to play, etc. And yet it seems like the more really new building, the more the cost of rent in Mountain View climbs, and it kind of catches on. So even not just the new and shiny stuff is expensive, but the market is higher, so things all around are climbing. And that is the worry of pricing people out that are living in the 1950s buildings that are still nice, but maybe no longer attainable if the prices keep climbing with the new builds. We talked about the sacrifice, and we were looking at, well, you could work with people beforehand to get them on board with how this helps the city, so they maybe accept what's coming down right in their block. Or maybe you could just plan to build these in areas that they gradually rise up, so you don't have a disparity in heights to really upset the adjacent properties. There were other suggestions, like could condos be a lot smaller, or apartment units, and then that way make them more affordable. And definitely we were looking at more ownership, condos instead of just apartments. And how about some kind of incentive for developers to do things like that? Maybe the economy units, or efficiency, that's the word, efficiency, like a studio condo or a studio apartment. Somebody was talking about allowing in-law units behind homes so that we could build units for family or to rent out on larger lots where private homes are. Maybe we should change some of the laws that would allow more people to live in a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom flat. They could have 8 or 9 people living there. Then we have to adjust our parking formula accordingly. They may not all just ride a bike. Maybe they have motorcycles or some old cars, and that's what they need to get where they're trying to be employed. So we'll have to adjust the parking formula. We had also a little discussion about supply and demand. Some people think if you build ever more, it will bring down rents because supply and demand will balance. But some of us see that the more we build, the more interest in living in Mountain View grows also. So demand is just going up more and more. And the prices higher and higher. The more we build, it's like, well, everybody wants to live here now. Look at all these new shiny places. So maybe hire locally, try to do more conferencing by computer for these businesses, and they can include their staff in Seattle and wherever, and they don't all have to drive in every day. Maybe encourage more public transit options, more regional solution, and more of the company shuttles and community mass transit, and help solve the traffic problem, and that'll ease the gridlock. And there are a lot more ideas, but that's enough. Who's next? Here we go. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a brief summary of what we talked about in our group. One, again, was the definition of affordability, and most agreed that it's having people who work here be able to live here, have people who take care of seniors, take care of our disability community, be able to afford to live near the people they take care of, and not have to be priced out, to be able to pay a reasonable rent that is not more than 30% of your income. And then we also talked about what diversity meant to this group. And we talked about the importance of diversity because it enriches our lives. It promotes understanding. It means we are not living in a monolithic culture or a cultural bubble. It is also intergenerational. And we also started talking about some potential solutions and the need to increase housing supply and find creative ways to work with city council to do that. Maybe if you request that if you're going to build more office, build more units or the equal amount of units. And we also talked about stabilizing the rent increases. We heard a few testimonies from folks here about $400 increases and not being able to afford their apartment anymore. That's all.
One more, so let's, you'll take us home, huh? This is a powerful group of women in this room tonight.
Yeah, that's Mountain View. Okay, well, I've lost my notes because it froze, but that's okay. Yeah, I think the summary of our group was we were talking about if this is is this a regional problem and what is our role in it was a big part of our conversation. And I think it was just a really interesting conversation because we shared really what our experiences and perspectives were as someone who owns a house and doesn't want to see the property value going down, doesn't want to see their community change, has spent decades in this community and the struggles that come with the changes there. And some, you know, people who've just moved here and want to live near their family and just cannot afford the rent. So we shared different perspectives. And I think we really thought kind of creative out of the box, like it seems like everyone here did, in terms of solutions to, you know, having more economic development in the Central Valley. And then that might solve all our problems here, but also just more balance in terms of supply and demand, better transportation so that people can live further away. So we had a number of solutions. I think I would just end this with, we agreed that there was a problem, and we need to, this is, I think, representative of the group, but we need to think regionally and act locally.
All right. I'll go all night if you just.
Well, we touched on quite a few of the issues that the other groups have mentioned. It's interesting that we have a lot of solidarity here. So I'll try to pick out some things that are a little bit unusual, though. We have some personal stories of people who are suffering greatly because they've lived in a place with substandard maintenance and the rent keeps going up and nothing is done, and there seems to be a hostility among some landlords to try to move people out. So this is a serious problem for many. And the usual things about people would like to be able to live near where they work and so forth. And that Mountain View has really emphasized commercial development instead of housing. But I think perhaps our new city council members will work on that. But one thing that was particularly interesting is the HRC, is that it? Has a program of block grants that will help property owners to refurbish units. There's the money available, but because of government bureaucracy, it takes so long to get this money funneled to the right place that often the property becomes snapped up by developers who put high-cost housing on it. So I'm not sure how something like that could be worked out unless that the city could lend some money to kind of bridge the gap so that the repairs could be done and so forth. With regard to the diversity, of course, everyone says we don't want to live in a monocultural society, but one person brought out what I think is really interesting, that one of the costs of lack of diversity is gentrification and ghettoization, so that the people who have no money are all clustered together in substandard housing, and they are unhappy, they feel discriminated against, and this can breed crime and violence, the projects, for example. So if you have in one development a mixture of higher cost and affordable housing altogether, where the units are exactly the same, you eliminate that problem. And Mountain View does indeed have an ordinance where 5 to 10% of each new building project should have, there should be 5 or 10% affordable unless the developer pays a certain fee to the city, which should be used to build its own housing. But unfortunately, there's not much incentive there because the value of the square footage of the property, it's easier for the developer to pay the fine. And if this were raised, perhaps they would be more inclined to comply with this regulation. Yeah, if the escape were taken away. Anybody, anything else?
Well said.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, so I'd like to thank all the community members who came out and made this night possible. It was a very interesting night, and I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I'd like to thank Project Sentinel and the Mountain View Mediators for helping in each of the breakout groups. I'd like to thank our okay, give a round of applause for that. I'd like to thank our excellent, knowledgeable, and talented Roundtable participants. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to thank Chris Block for doing an excellent job moderating and kind of guiding us through. One more person I'd like to thank. This is the last Civility Roundtable that one of our commissioners is going to be able to attend. Jamil Sheikh has been on the Human Relations Commission for 10 years, right? 10 years, and he's about to be termed out next month. And so thank you for everything you've done, Jamil, for Mountain View and for the Human Relations Commission. We're going to miss you. Okay, thank you, Jamil. But if you ever want to find him, you'll find him at the Gyro House, okay? That's where I find him. So at 8:30, we'll adjourn, and thank you for coming.